Imagine waking up one morning and realizing that everything you thought you knew about justice, national security, and political power was only half the story. Because behind the headlines, behind the speeches, behind the noise, something enormous has been happening quietly, methodically, and with a level of precision that Washington insiders never wanted you to see. Quiet resignations in the hundreds. A bombshell Supreme Court ruling that flips the balance of power in Congress. A nearly 5-year-old terrorism mystery solved in a single administration shift. Federal agents sweeping through communities where fraud turned into pipelines worth billions. And elected officials being arrested in scandals that read like something out of a different country. For months, these stories were treated as independent events. But when you put them together, a startling pattern begins to emerge. One that answers a question millions of Americans have been whispering: what exactly is being exposed? And why now? Today, we're going to connect the dots. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what changed, who's panicking, and why the people in power never wanted any of this brought into the light. Let me take you back to a moment that most people missed. It wasn't a speech. It wasn't a tweet. It was a convergence. Multiple earthquakes hitting the political landscape all at once. Each one significant on its own, but together revealing something much deeper. Within the span of just a few weeks, 5 major stories broke almost simultaneously. Hundreds of federal attorneys resigned from the Department of Justice. The Supreme Court handed down a decision that fundamentally reshaped how congressional districts could be drawn. A suspect was arrested in the January 6th pipe bomb case after nearly 5 years of silence. Federal immigration enforcement launched one of its largest operations ever, targeting a specific community in Minneapolis. And a Somali elected official in Maine was arrested on felony charges tied to gun theft and a condemned property linked to a massive drug raid. Now, if you heard about any one of these stories in isolation, you might have thought interesting, troubling maybe, but not earth-shattering. But here's what makes this different. These weren't isolated incidents. They were all part of a much larger shift, one that signaled structural changes inside government institutions that many never saw coming. So where do we begin? Let's start with the moment Washington first felt the ground shift beneath its feet. Picture the Supreme Court, that marble monument to stability and precedent. For years, redistricting battles have been fought in the shadows, with lower courts stepping in to block or approve new maps based on claims of racial or partisan gerrymandering. But then, in a decision that sent shockwaves through the political establishment, the court sided with Texas in a case that allowed the state to use newly drawn congressional maps. Maps expected to flip as many as 5 Democratic-held seats to Republicans. Now, the legal argument here is important. The court didn't just rubber stamp the maps. It made a clear statement. The decision to redraw districts was based on politics, not race. In other words, the Texas legislature decided these new districts based on partisan goals, and the court said that's within their rights. A lower court had blocked the maps, arguing that racial considerations were at play. But the Supreme Court disagreed, saying the lower court had no jurisdiction to interfere with the state's decision to redraw legislative maps for partisan reasons. Think about what that means. States across the country now have a green light, a clear signal that they can reshape their political landscapes, even mid-decade, as long as they're doing it for partisan advantage and not racial discrimination. And Texas took full advantage. Their new maps added dozens of new districts, with expectations that around 30 would lean Republican and fewer than 10 would favor Democrats. The implications are enormous heading into the midterms and beyond. But here's where it gets even more interesting. This decision didn't just affect Texas. It set a precedent. California, for example, is facing its own redistricting lawsuit from the Trump Justice Department. If the Supreme Court's logic is applied consistently, California might have the same freedom to redraw its maps. And if that happens, we're looking at a nationwide reshuffling of political power, one that could lock in advantages for whichever party controls state legislators. Critics, of course, were quick to cry foul. They argued that this was an assault on civil rights, that it would disenfranchise minority voters, that it was a step backward for democracy. But if you actually read the dissent from Justice Elena Kagan, even she acknowledged that the plaintiffs challenging the map didn't do a good enough job proving that race was the motivating factor. They needed to produce their own map showing that the state's partisan goals could have been achieved by other means. They didn't. And so the court ruled accordingly. Now, while the courts were shifting power on paper, something equally dramatic was happening inside the Department of Justice itself. And this is where the story gets truly fascinating. Enter Harriet Dillon, the newly appointed Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights. Now, you might not have heard of her before, but believe me, Washington insiders certainly have, and they're not happy, because in literally her second week on the job, Dillon did something that no one expected. She issued a memo, simple, direct, and absolutely explosive in its implications. The memo stated that from now on, the Civil Rights Division would protect the rights of all Americans, not just some. It emphasized that the division would pivot away from the priorities of the previous administration. Instead of focusing exclusively on traditional civil rights protections for racial and sexual minorities, the new agenda would emphasize dismantling all diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, not just within the department, but throughout the nation. It would bury the transgender rights policies of the previous administration, and it would commit to weeding out and ending anti-Christian bias across the country. Now, to you and me, that might sound like, well, the law, equal protection under the law, that's what we were all taught in school, right? But to the entrenched bureaucracy inside the DOJ, it was kryptonite. It was sunlight to a vampire. Almost immediately after that memo was released, over 100 civil rights attorneys showed their true colors and resigned on the spot. Overnight, Dillon lost about a third of the division's attorneys. Let that sink in for a moment. A third of her staff walked out because they were told they had to treat everyone equally. And Dillon's reaction, did she beg them to stay? Did she cower? Did she apologize? Not even close. She held the door open for them. She doubled down. She openly and publicly welcomed and accepted these resignations as signs that, in her words, nature was healing, that the administrative state that had so adversely affected the politics of the nation was taking itself out. In fact, she doubled down so much that more and more Tonys came out and said, we can't do this, we're done. We're left-wing ideologues and we have no home here anymore. As of just weeks ago, altogether upwards of 70% of the DOJ's Civil Rights Division, over 200 attorneys, accepted a resignation offer. They are gone. And again, Dillon didn't blink. She said the departures represented far-left ideologues unwilling to enforce federal law neutrally. She noted the irony. These weren't mass firings. This wasn't some authoritarian purge. This was staff self-selecting out over fundamental disagreements about the division's new mission, which may remind you was about protecting the rights of all, not merely some. Now, the legacy media, of course, spun this as chaos, as evidence of an administration running roughshod over the Constitution. But that's only because the legacy media doesn't report news. It reports narratives. What's sold as neutral reporting is too often activism in disguise, crafted to guide perception rather than reveal truth. But resignations weren't the only shock. Because elsewhere in the government, a cold case suddenly broke wide open, a case that had haunted investigators and the public for nearly 5 years. Do you remember the January 6th pipe bombs? 2 devices placed outside the Republican and Democratic National Committee headquarters the night before the Capitol incident, live explosives that thankfully never detonated. But for years, the FBI told us they were working the case, following leads, reviewing millions of pieces of data. They arrested hundreds of individuals who were at the Capitol that day, many of whom did nothing more than walk around and take selfies. But the person who placed actual bombs, nowhere to be found until now. In just 10 months, under the new administration, the FBI made an arrest. Brian Cole, a 30-year-old man from Woodbridge, Virginia, just a few miles from Washington. The ECC was taken into custody and charged with transporting an explosive device in interstate commerce and attempted malicious destruction by means of explosive materials. Now, here's what makes this arrest so stunning. At the press conference announcing the charges, officials admitted something remarkable. There was no new evidence, no new tip, no surprise witness coming forward. What changed was the investigation itself. A new team of investigators and experts was brought in. They re-examined every piece of evidence. They sifted through all the data, over 3 million lines of information, something the prior administration, according to officials, refused and failed to do. Let me repeat that. The evidence was sitting there the whole time. What was missing wasn't information, it was will, it was focus, it was leadership that prioritized solving the case over other agendas? One official put it bluntly, "This is what it's like when you work for a president who tells you to go get the bad guys and stop focusing on other extraneous things not related to law enforcement. This is what happens." Now, of course, there's still questions. What was the motive? Was this politically motivated? Was there a larger network involved? Those details haven't been fully revealed yet, and that's because the investigation is ongoing. But the fact that arrest was made after years of nothing speaks volumes about what changes when priorities shift at the top. And while investigators were cracking old cases, another crisis was erupting, this time in Minneapolis. And this one involves fraud on a scale that's almost hard to believe. Over the past several years, federal prosecutors uncovered what they're now calling one of the largest welfare fraud schemes in American history. We're talking about a network of individuals who allegedly stole billions, yes, billions with a B, from programs designed to help children, families, and vulnerable populations, child nutrition programs, housing assistance, autism services, the list goes on. And at the center of this massive fraud network, the Somali community in Minnesota. Now, before anyone accuses me of painting with too broad a brush, let me be clear. Not all Somali immigrants are involved in fraud, obviously. But federal prosecutors have said plainly that Minnesota became a hub of fraudulent money laundering activity and that a significant portion of the schemes involved members of the Somali diaspora, the largest such community in the United States, with numbers in the tens of thousands. Here's where it gets even more troubling. Some of the stolen money that was supposed to feed hungry kids, may have ended up in the hands of Al-Shabaab, an Al-Qaeda-linked terror group operating in Somalia. Let that sink in for a moment. American taxpayer dollars stolen through welfare fraud, potentially funding terrorism abroad, and the response for years, not much. Programs continued, warnings were ignored, audits were delayed until finally the new administration said enough. Over 100 federal agents were deployed to Minneapolis in street patrol. Armored vehicles rolled into neighborhoods, targeted raids began, and arrests followed, dozens of them. This wasn't a routine operation. This was one of the largest enforcement actions ever directed at a specific immigrant community in U.S. history. And it sent a message: the days of looking the other way are over. But as agents carried out arrests in Minneapolis, a related scandal was unfolding more than 1,000 miles away in a small city in Maine. And this story, if anything, is even stranger. Iman Osman, a Somali man elected to the city council in Leeuwen, Maine, was just indicted on 2 felony counts for allegedly stealing firearms. But that's only the beginning. Osman was already facing scrutiny for claiming to live at an address that turned out to be condemned. A property connected to a federal drug raid where agents seized over 20 pounds of methamphetamine, cocaine, fentanyl, and firearms. When the city clerk asked him to verify his address, his lawyers said he couldn't disclose it because his life was in danger. He was getting death threats, they claimed. But when reporters checked with the Leeuwen Police Department, they found absolutely no record, none of any police report filed about threats. So here you have a Somali man who won't confirm where he lives, tied to a condemned property linked to a massive drug operation, now facing felony gun charges, and yet he was about to be sworn into public office. And this raises an uncomfortable question. How did we get here? How did someone with this background not only get elected, but remain in office even as the scandals piled up? The answer, I think, has to do with a broader failure of accountability, a failure that spans multiple levels of government and multiple communities. And nowhere is that failure more visible than in the response from one of the most prominent Somali American politicians in the country. Ilhan Omar, the U.S. Congresswoman representing Minneapolis, was recently interviewed on CNN, and the host did something almost unheard of in mainstream media. He pressed her directly on the massive fraud scandal engulfing her community. Her response, let's just say it was revealing. When asked directly why fraud got so out of control in Minnesota, Omar's answer was to blame program design. She said that when you have new programs designed to help people, you're often relying on third parties to facilitate. And these programs were set up so quickly that guardrails weren't put in place. Now, let's think about that for a moment. Nearly 60 people have been convicted in schemes that stole over $1 billion money meant to feed children. Federal prosecutors have documented a pattern of fraud that even a Somali-American professor at Mallister College acknowledged is rooted in cultural patterns brought over from Somalia, where, in his words, stealing from a dysfunctional and corrupt government was widespread. And Omar's response focused on program design flaws rather than the people who committed the crimes. It's textbook deflection, and unfortunately, it's part for the course in the world of identity politics that dominates the modern Democratic Party, because acknowledging the problem would mean acknowledging uncomfortable truths. Truths about cultural integration, about the challenges of importing large populations from failed states, about the responsibilities that come with citizenship and public trust. And here's what makes this even more troubling. This isn't just an American problem. Norway, which has a significant Somali population, has documented similar welfare fraud patterns. By early 2017, Norwegian authorities had hundreds of fraud cases under investigation, disproportionately involving Somali immigrants. A Reuters investigation found that welfare and international aid theft remains a daily reality in Somalia itself, with an entire ecosystem profiting from misappropriation, camp owners, local officials, aid workers, all taking their cut. So when critics talk about importing third world problems, this is exactly what they mean. Cultural patterns, particularly around trust in institutions, rule of law, and civic responsibility, don't disappear just because someone crosses a border. And when those patterns collide with generous welfare systems and inadequate oversight, the results can be catastrophic. Now, while all of this was unfolding in Minneapolis and Maine, another powerful political figure was facing her own reckoning in the courts. And this one involves someone who spent years weaponizing her office against political opponents. Letitia James, the Attorney General of New York, became a household name for her relentless pursuit of Donald Trump and his business empire. She filed lawsuits, launched investigations, and made no secret of her political motivations. But recently, the tables turned in a way that few saw coming. The Trump Justice Department attempted to bring mortgage fraud charges against James, charges that had previously been thrown out by a court. But when prosecutors went back to a grand jury seeking a new indictment, something unexpected happened. The grand jury declined to indict. Now, for those of you who might not be familiar with how grand juries work, let me give you some context. There's an old saying among lawyers, a prosecutor could indict a ham sandwich. Grand juries almost always go along with what prosecutors recommend because the bar for indictment is relatively low. You don't need to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. You just need to show probable cause that a crime may have been committed. So for a grand jury to decline an indictment is actually pretty significant. It suggests either that the evidence was weaker than prosecutors believed, or that the jurors themselves had doubts about the case, and the response from commentators across the political spectrum was telling. Even some who support aggressive prosecution of political corruption said the same thing. Stop announcing charges before you have cases that stick. Stop using the justice system as a political weapon. Build your case properly, get your evidence in order, and then move forward. Because what we've seen over the past several years, from both sides, frankly, is a tendency to rush to judgment, to make splashy announcements for political gain, and then watch as cases fall apart under scrutiny. But while prosecutors struggled with cases against political figures, lawmakers were facing their own reckoning over an entirely different issue, one that's been escalating for years and has finally reached a breaking point. I'm talking about the war on drugs, or more specifically, the war on narco-terror networks operating along our southern border and beyond. For decades, the standard approach was interdiction. Coast Guard ships would intercept drug boats, seize the cargo, arrest the crew, and prosecute them in U.